Okay, and finally, after country comes the people who make everything possible. MAP ABCDF is a member-supported nonprofit organization, and without the generosity and support of our partners, members, and special partner institutions, we really would not be here today. So let us give our thanks to everyone who makes MAP ABCDF possible. All right. Um, Okay, so once again, good morning to everyone. And I am your chairman, Julius Barcelona. It's great to see everyone this morning joining us today for what I think will be a very lively and spirited discussion. If you're joining us 2 weeks later through our social media on YouTube or on Facebook, welcome. If you are interested, MAP, as I mentioned, MAP ABCDF is a member-supported nonprofit organization. If you'd like to engage with our speakers and with our network of agribusiness and countryside development organizations, please do consider joining us as a member. You can send an email to introduce yourself to register at map-abcdf.org. Link is in the description below. Okay, I think our president still has not joined us this morning. So if I may just very briefly introduce our speaker for this morning. So we are very pleased to have the executive director of Ibon Foundation, an independent non-government organization providing research, information, and education services to people's movements in the Philippines and abroad since 1978. So quite a storied organization in the Philippines. He is also the board member of Alter Media, a fellow of the for People's Empowerment in Governance, and the Center for Anti-Imperialist Studies on the Coordinating Committee of Pagbabago, People's Movement for Change, as well as being an editor on the online news magazine Bulatlat. He has previously worked as a member of the staff in the National Economic and Development Authority. He is also an evaluator of non-government organizations with Management Systems Advancement Incorporated, or MASAI. He is a legislative officer in Congress with Bayan Muna and works to organize peasant organizations, if I got that right. And his writings on socioeconomic and political issues have been extensively published by Ibon, by CAIS, by the Institute for Political Economy, as well as international NGOs such as the Asia Pacific Research Network, Reality of Aid, African Network for Debt and Development, Pesticide Action Network, and Transparency International, as well as the Philippine Center for Policy Studies. So we do have quite the esteemed speaker with us this morning, and I hope you will all join me in welcoming Jose Enrique Sonny Africa, Executive Director of the Ibon Foundation. Let us give him a warm welcome, everyone. Good morning, Sonny, and we're glad to have you with us today.
Hi, morning, Julius, and of course to MAP for the invitation again. I mentioned to Bernie earlier, I actually do want to attend more of the activities of MAP, especially for the discussions, but that early morning thing does get in the way because I'm usually in traffic. I'll Can I share my screen? I'm just trying to sort of figure out.
Oh yeah, sure. Let me.
Okay, should I start na ba, or should we wait for Sir Ordonez pa? Or...
No, it's all right. If I know Ernie wouldn't want us to wait for you. He says follow the time, and yeah.
Okay. Let me sort of try to go to the pinaka start. Sige. I was asked to give a quick input on the Philippine Development Plan. It's kind of daunting because it's a 560-page document with all its annexes and results matrices. So of course, I think the most important thing naman to highlight is the premises of the plan. Philippine development plans are not new in the Philippines. We've had them since the Cordero Pan in the 1940s. So I think the question always is, if we plan so much, how come we're still where we are? So siguro the main presentation, the main message I think I want to register is it's a good time since the PDP was just released at the end of last year. The NEDA's already started, I think, more or less weekly forums on chapters. So I think it actually is a good time to kind of pause, step back, look at the big picture, and really just take stock of where we are. Kasi it's always nice to once in a while look at the underlying issues, look at our premises for development planning, and then see are we correct with our premises. Our contention in Ibon, Ibon's been around since 1978. I haven't been there that long. I've been there since the mid 2000s, but we do have enough institutional memory to have a broad overview of how the development plans have brought us to where we are. So I want to start off lang with a very short introduction of where we are, and then the rest of the presentation is really just about inviting some questioning about the premises of the plan as of course, a guide to what else can we do differently to get somewhere else from where we are right now. I want to start with something that's been especially notable since the past administration. Part of President Duterte's populism was, of course, the disinformation about the political situation. But we also did notice a lot of disinformation even on the economic front, especially under the previous administration. We think that eternal economic populist sunshine, okay, I mean, we do want people to get an endorphin rush about where we are. We do want to inspire, motivate people to look ahead, to keep moving forward. But of course, sometimes, especially when it comes to something as critical as the economy, you kind of, I think, we assume you want to be more factual than not. Because otherwise, how do we identify the problems if we think that everything's always parang great and fantastic? And I think one thing that a lot of people we talk to have seemed to have forgotten after 6 years of Secretary Dominguez's Eternal Sunshine, and after about half a year now of even Secretary Jokno's following through with that, with his own version of Eternal Sunshine, the Philippines, despite seemingly rapid growth since the 2000s, we're like hitting our second decade now of relatively rapid growth historically. Historical growth in the Philippines has been about 5%. We've been hitting 6, sometimes 7% in the last 15, 20 years. I think it should be very striking. Why aren't development results being felt on the ground? And for us, we do want to start off with a point of correction. Growth is a very narrow metric of development. It does not reflect the conditions of ordinary Filipinos. It could help, I mean, of course, the bigger pie, so yung claim naman palagi. If you have a bigger pie, there's more to share around. But if you look at the last 20 years of pretty rapid economic growth in the Philippines, it should be very striking. We're in a pretty bad place. And that's not to be negative just for the sake of being negative. That's just to dig up the data so that we know where we're starting from, so that we know what we're doing wrong, so that hopefully we can start experimenting and doing things better. So I just those two memes, or I don't know what you call them, those two screenshots on the left and right side, they're like just some of the recent examples of this disconnected populist sunshine. When the president said that the Philippines was leading economic recovery and driving growth in Asia Pacific and the whole world, you can grant politicians hyperbole once in a while, but it seems to have become a point of propaganda guideline for the Philippine economic team to just not tell the truth about the Philippine economy. And just the other day, again, another burst of populist sunshine. Si Secretary Jokno, before a group of Japanese investors, said that, well, he gloated, he bragged about our quote-unquote best full-year performance in 46 years, referring, of course, to GDP growth in 2022. But then again, a bit, kind of, for me, kind of unbecoming of an economic manager. to claim that the Philippines is brimming with economic energy and all this vitality. Even Secretary Balisacan, normally someone who's a bit more circumspect about social indicators, has quite recently under his term now under the current president, maybe with the Ilocano connection, he's actually been predisposed to terms like vibrant, strong, sustained as well. So what I flashed there is some actually key data, which I think belies those claims of an economy brimming with vitality and energy and an economy leading economic recovery. We have to remember the Philippines was had the second worst economic collapse in the whole of East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia, second only to Maldives, which of course, being so tourism dependent, but it's also kind of small, so it'd be a bit of a special case. But second to Maldives in the whole of Asia in terms of economic collapse because of the protracted lockdowns. Despite the claim of, again, rapid growth last year, we're actually, for those who care to ask, I can provide them with the data. We're actually the third slowest economy to recover. The growth was so fast only because we're climbing out of a hole that was so deep. And again, despite not just the rapid growth last year, and not just because of the poor COVID response of like the endless lockdowns, some among the longest, harshest in the world, despite nearly 2 decades of above average economic growth, accelerating to reach above average historical economic growth, the Philippines has a third worst poverty incidence in ASEAN. It has the fourth worst Human Development Index. It's a composite of education, life expectancy, and income per capita. We also have the fourth worst GDP per capita. And I think that's so important because even kami sa Ibon, actually I'm quite surprised, once in a while when we share this numbers like this among our staff, some of them actually are also quite surprised kasi the economic propaganda that things are fantastic in the Philippines is really nothing short of relentless, not just in this administration, but in the past administrations. I think it's nice to check where we really are, especially by our closest regional benchmarks. Of course, ASEAN is quite varied. You have Singapore on one hand and Myanmar on the other hand. But if you want to benchmark our performance, I think our neighbors are the best way to benchmark our performance. And our bottom line there is we should be extremely critical about hyperbole, not just from our politicians, but very, very sadly, even hyperbole from our economic managers, because they're the ones who frame what the situation is to find solutions. And presumably, the Philippine Development Plan is supposedly one of the solutions we have. The PDP is a huge book. It's always been a huge book. It's like one of the 2 books I read, always reading. The first being, of course, the annual budget books. The PDP has 16 chapters. It has about 550 pages, including their results matrices in the annex. This is the infographic from the NEDA, but it basically does list the various chapters they have. There's an opening chapter on the lay of the land, domestically, internationally. And then there's a one whole part with 3 chapters on human capital, social development, on increasing income earning ability and protecting purchasing power. Then there's a second part on the economic sectors. There's one section on agriculture, one on industry, one on services. After that, there are 3 supposedly cross-cutting chapters on promoting trade and investment, advancing research and development, technology and innovation, enhancing industry linkages. And then the last 5 or 6 chapters, not necessarily all economic, but with some overlap between good governance, macro stability, competition, ensuring peace and security, expanding infrastructure, and then addressing climate change. So it's a huge book, 16 chapters. Of course, I'm not going to go through that. But we can actually digest our criticisms of the PDP in a few sentences. And just to be clear, this is assessing the PDP, not just from common sense notions of what development would be, but from its own declared intent of providing for economic transformation, for a prosperous, inclusive, and resilient society. So that kind of huge requirement for social and economic transformation that's well appreciated. So I think the question is, how do we measure that the PDP against that kind of high standard it sets for itself? Um, with over 500 pages, I think there may be three things that we appreciate most about the PDP. The first is this is a practice that started noticing under the Aquino administration. The first chapter tends to be quite candid about overall development not prospects, about overall development situation in the country, about there being a problem that needs to be fixed. And there's a much more in the recent PDPs, much more attention to locating the Philippine plan in terms of global trends. So one thing we very much appreciate in the PDP, the whole first chapter is actually quite a lucid summary of the global situation post-pandemic and some key economic and geopolitical trends. It does mention the war in the Ukraine. It mentions high commodity prices, food and fuel prices. It mentions the monetary tightening in the advanced capitalist countries and all of that. So that's actually quite good to sort of locate the plan. We argue later it doesn't go far enough, but that's a good start. Second thing, welcome with the plan. I did work with NEDA. I want to pick it up dun sa background. I spent about a year in NEDA, and I do know, I have kept in touch with friends since then, and I do know how much work comes into the plan. NEDA is mobilized in its entirety with their contacts with all the line agencies to sort of put things together, put the problems together, or the concrete steps forward, the realistic, doable, practical measures. So to be fair, maybe about 80 to 90% of the plan are, if they're implemented and they're actually done well, they could make things a little bit better. So I think that lucid articulation of so many measures that needs to be done, it is important to keep agencies on track, to keep the government on track. But our argument is not so much that these are unproductive to do, but the bigger things aren't addressed. Last point about it's very conscious about new technologies, digitalization, artificial intelligence. Of course, always have to keep up with that. Those are the three positive things. But then the red bits, I think, are the two main failings of the plan. What it does articulate, the hundreds of thousands of things that, if implemented, can improve certain sectors or maybe certain communities or certain parts of the economy. There are two major problems for us with them. Because it does have a huge section of results matrices. It's compiled in a separate annex. But it's very striking that despite talking about social and economic transformation, it actually lacks ambition and it lacks some key indicators for development. In terms of lacking ambition, just to take one example, the target for agricultural growth is about 3%, I think, which is not that ambitious because historically the agriculture sector, with its up and downs, quite wildly varying, as we all know, it has averaged already about 2.5 or 2.7, 2.6% over the last 20 years. So a 3% agricultural sector growth rate over the entire plan period is actually not that ambitious, despite the president saying, that's why I'm on top of things. I want more budget. I want to do some grand things. It's not actually that ambitious. And I think also very important is it says so many things. It's like, you want, it's like having a Christmas tree. You want a nice Christmas tree. You want even nicer ornaments to make the Christmas tree perfect. The PDP is all about the ornaments, but not really about the tree. So it's a bit hollow in that sense. The skeleton's quite dodgy in terms of its basic premises about what it means to develop agriculture and industry for inclusivity and social transformation. It has all the nice things, but it's actually in the end quite superficial. And we have two main points of contention that need much more attention for a real development plan, for a real social economic transformation. The first is there has to be a more determined effort to develop the domestic production sectors. Like I said, it's a virtually status quo plan about domestic agriculture. I mean, no plan will say that we want to destroy agriculture, destroy industry, make people more miserable. So in that sense, motherhoods maybe take up about half the plan, which is can be expected, but it's quite striking that the plan does not offer anything new in terms of developing agriculture, in terms of developing domestic industry. Surprisingly, despite a whole chapter on climate change, nothing really is committed in terms of more sustainable production, with due recognition of the environmental problems we're facing. Second key problem, especially talking about transformation, this in a over 500-page document, there's very little about more rigorous efforts for better equity and inclusion. There's no, for instance, no mention of a family living wage. Just last year, we were told by the government they've officially stopped calculating the family living wage, which is very odd. It's not like wages are less important now. There's no real mention, despite the whole chapter, on improving the balance of rural incomes between traders and farmers, or between farmers and the remaining landlords. There's absolutely no talk about a more progressive tax system. It talks about the usual Duterte era simplicity of the tax system, but it actually just has nothing to do, nothing mentioned about making sure that those who can pay more, and those who can't pay as much pay less. So no measures for more progressivity in the tax system, like a wealth tax. And of course, despite a whole chunk on improving people's well-being, there's one part with 3 chapters, one chapter on human capital and social development. There's actually, strikingly, no real mention of greater priority to social services and social protection. And to take one example, the plan was made last year, released at the end of December. When the 2023 budget was finally passed a few weeks before the plan, sure enough, we did see cuts in social protection across the board, especially, but not only around the Ayuda, the COVID Ayuda programs. Even the 40s program, the flagship cash transfer program, was cut by 5 or 6 billion pesos. So I think those are very striking for us, and they will be the most damaging aspects of the plan. I hope I have 8 more minutes. Is that correct? Just to correct myself, 20 minutes.
Sure, go
Yeah.
ahead.
Okay. So that's our overall concern about the point about socioeconomic transformation. I'm going to give a bit more detail to address any nagging doubts about there needing to be a bigger change in terms of our development plans. First, again, just to be quite clear, we have loads of development plans. I'm only listing the ones since near the end of the Marcos era, because of the commonality of the Marcos plans since actually the 1978 to 1982 5-year PDP until the current Marcos Jr. era development plan. One of the most common threads among these, especially if you remember, those who remember their history, excuse me, the late 1970s were the time that the Philippines was under not just an IMF, International Monetary Fund Stabilization Program, we also came underneath the first structural adjustment program of the World Bank in Asia, and I think only the second, at most the third in the whole world. So the 5-year Philippine Development Plan, it had these traces of the Marcos dictatorship's sort of nationalist posturings, but we actually could already see in the plan the market shift towards, at that time, neoclassical economics, in more recent times called neoliberal economics. The market orientation of the economy already started to be incorporated as early as the late 1970s development plans of the Marcos administration. So the main common thread across all these plans, I'm not really going to count, across all these maybe 40 years of development plans, the common thread is that it's like if I got my economics textbooks from college, which says that market forces are a magic bullet, some kind of invisible hand for development. Policy making should be about taking away all the constraints to market forces. Basically, all these plans have been about taking away so-called restrictions to market forces, whether it's in terms of opening up to foreign trade, opening up to foreign investment, taking away government heavy-handedness in state enterprises, taking away government regulations. That has been the driving spirit of plans for the past 40 years. Take away restrictions to the market, And the invisible hand will bring us towards some kind of development. And one point I want to raise also is that the first slide we showed about the social indicators vis-a-vis ASEAN, this actually is one aspect of the result of all these plans. The economy is not something you change with one plan or with one policy measure. It's a result of an accumulation of measures. And what we have had over the last 40 years is an accumulation of these so-called free market measures under the spirit of the invisible hand. No one talks about trickle down right now, it's so discredited, but that's basically still the kind of notion for development and equity and inclusion right now. Some stylized facts. I'm not sure if I may actually have showed this to some of you before, maybe in previous forums. The upper left side, upper side, the chart on the upper left shows the economic sectors of the Philippines since the 1940s when data started to be generated. The bottom chart shows employment shares by sector. The key point that has to be raised here is that the dark blue line at the very top, this is an aggregation of manufacturing, agriculture, construction, and mining and quarrying. So it's basically the conventionally understood production sectors in the economy. So it should be very striking that it was more or less flat since the 1940s. And then, not coincidentally, when all these free market influence development plans started to be implemented in the late 1970s, that's the moment that that line started to go down. Basically, our breaking the Philippine development experience into more or less two phases. One phase is the late 1940s until the late 1970s. That's more or less the flat lines you see on the left side of the chart. But very striking, the slopes changed after the late 1970s. And we argue that's because of the increasing trend towards trade and investment liberalization. Manufacturing now has fallen to its smallest share of GDP since 1950. It's also the smallest share of employment in its history. We have actually the smallest manufacturing sector in ASEAN outside of Brunei, which is, again, quite small and a natural oil intensive economy. Agriculture is the smallest share of GDP and employment in our post-war history. Of course, a big reason is the growing population, limited land. I mean, how much can you squeeze out of finite land? But I think that is very striking that even agriculture productivity has not kept up with the growing population. I think that's one important point that the plan really just fails to see. The accumulation of these plans of believing that opening up to foreign trade investment would increase competition, not only has it not industrialized the country or developed agriculture, it actually made things much worse, driving us to where we are right now. And we also even argue in Ibon, the lost decades of development after the Marcos dictatorship were a combination not just of the debt overhang left by the previous Marcos dictatorship, but also this is a period of transition where things were opened up quite recklessly to the WTO, to ASEAN free trade agreements without corresponding state support. Second point, I'm running out of time, but I do want to stress there is enough data to show that informality has been worsening. The government has made a big deal about unemployment rates supposedly falling, but we have two important points to raise about that. First, they changed the definition of unemployment so that discouraged workers and those unable to immediately take up work are suddenly not counted as unemployed anymore. So they're basically, by our estimation, at least 2 to 3 million Filipinos without jobs, but because of this new restriction in the unemployment figures, they're jobless but not counted as unemployed. So that takes down the number of those who are counted as unemployed. Second key point, even among those who are employed, informality has worsened. Most jobs created since before the pandemic, comparing January 2020 to the current, they're actually in the informal sector. Informal meaning self-employment, or even if in establishments, they're informal establishments, they're house help perhaps. And that is a huge problem, that to claim unemployment is decreasing and employment is improving, but without grasping that we're not actually counting a lot of unemployed, We're also counting a lot of employed who are not even earning anything. There are about 4.4 million unpaid family workers considered unemployed but unpaid. So I think we should be a bit more critical about that kind of data being mentioned. The chart on the top shows trade deficits. The red bar are the trade deficits in dollar terms. The line is the trade deficit as a share of GDP. Again, just to highlight, these are trade data since the late 1940s. It does make sense that trade deficits would worsen upon liberalization because we opened up the imports more broad, which lacking the domestic capacity to compete because of lack of government support. We're importing more, exporting less, hence the increasing trade deficits. So even that worrying thing about our chronically depreciating peso, ultimately it comes from we don't have enough foreign exchange, even with OFWs to pay for our imports, and the trade deficit, which has been chronic ever since and has been worsening, especially since the mid-1990s, is a case in point. The chart on the left shows manufacturing sectors in Southeast Asia, just to highlight that pre-Marcos era, manufacturing in the Philippines was the largest in Southeast Asia, but now we're I correct myself, we're not the third smallest, we're the fourth smallest in Southeast Asia today. Another point we do want to stress, there's a whole chapter in the PDP on promoting trade and investment. Just yesterday, despite the president supposedly saying, we don't need charter change, his cousin railroaded, well, not railroaded, but shepherded charter change resolution through the committee level yesterday. So there's still the notion that trade and investment liberalization is the way to develop the economy. So we have like one major point and two subsidiary points there. One major point is that the Philippines has been liberalizing extensively in terms of trade and investment since the 1980s with the adverse and we argue anti-development outcomes. Two subsidiary points. Foreign investment in particular has not developed the national economy. The chart on the left shows the bar chart is absolute amounts of foreign investment flowing to the country. The line is in terms of share of GDP. So despite our foreign investment restrictions, foreign investment has been growing in the country. So you actually, if they're so good for development, you kind of wonder where the development gains are. But one thing we also want to stress in terms of foreign investment, another subsidiary point, the Philippines now actually has more foreign investment than South Korea, Taiwan, and China did during their periods of economic takeoff in the 1970s and 80s. And I think that's a key point that a lot of these investment addicts seem to forget. If you look at the stock of foreign investment, the lower rows, the Philippines has right now nearly 30% equivalent of GDP of foreign investment stock. Compare that to how much South Korea, Taiwan, and China had when they were doing their economic takeoff. We have basically 20, 25, 30 times more foreign investment in the country now than these countries did when they were taking off. The point we want to highlight is not that foreign investment cannot develop the economy. The point is, for foreign investment to help develop the economy, there has to be a certain policy regime in place in terms of ensuring that the benefits are not one-sided in favor of foreign investors. So in the last 40 years, we've been in a race to the bottom, trying to give everything to foreign investors, including right now this last Chacha effort. But I want to highlight, foreign investment was not actually key to the development success of some of the major countries we kind of look highly upon right now. So that's one subsidiary point about foreign investment. We really have to interrogate that claim that foreign investment is a magic bullet for development. It did not develop the Philippines substantially. It was not even a key element in the development experience of our Asian neighbors. Second subsidiary point, I'm really about to wrap up. Trade protectionism now, I think, is it's been picking up since the pandemic, but even with the WHO about to declare the end of the pandemic, trade protection is still getting worse. The chart on the top actually shows the number of trade interventions, not just since the pandemic, that's that little big blip there, but since the 2008-2009 financial crisis. it should be quite noticeable that the green bit actually shows protectionist policies implemented and the red part liberalization policies implemented. Especially since the pandemic, but actually particularly since 2008, 2009, trade liberalization actually is not as dominant as trade protection. And of course, we're going to talk about US, China, Japan, Europe later on if someone asks. Second point, it's more or less we get the same sort of trend as well in terms of investment liberalization. The chart on the top upper left comes from the UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. The green part shows investment protection measures implemented since 2008, 2009. The red part shows liberalization measures. So in terms of, again, just trajectories, not talking about magnitudes yet, the trajectory is more and more investment regulation and actually less and less investment liberalization in the last decade. I didn't point it out, but the other two charts below showed the effect in terms of global trade investment flows. Global trade has been flattening out because of increasing protection. Global investment also has been flattening out because of increasing protection. Again, against the backdrop of a slowing global economy. Last point about investment, I attended a forum with Rep. Stella Kimbo, who made a big deal about the OECD Foreign Restrictiveness Index in the Philippines ranking quite low. The chart on the left shows the ranking of all the countries in that index, from left most open, right most closed. True enough, the Philippines is the blue bar. We are among the most restrictive globally. But the thing is, the claim is that because we're so restrictive, we stop investment from coming in. The red dots actually show percentage of foreign direct investment inflows as a share of GDP. You will notice that across countries, if the claim was that more restrictions would mean less investments, then the way the red dots should have been clustered should have been on a diagonal line going downwards from upper left corner to the lower right corner. But again, there are a few outliers, but it should be quite striking that despite increasing restrictiveness or despite increasing openness, foreign investment flows actually cluster around a certain range, regardless of the investment flows. So I think that weak correlation between investment restrictiveness and foreign investment flows should belie any claims that it's just about attracting foreign investment. Foreign investment cares about other things apart from the restrictions, but also to bring it back to the earlier point, is foreign investment really the key for national development? I want to close with one last point. The Philippines is always, our stereotype is that we have a very bloated bureaucracy, it's a flabby government, it's so inefficient. Well, actually, after 40 years of globalization thinking and then telling the state to pull out, the Philippines actually has one of the smallest governments in the world, whether it's a share of public employment to total employment or it's a share of government spending to GDP. In both instances, we're in the bottom third of governments worldwide. And the key conclusion there is that we actually have one of the least interventionist governments in the world in that sense of using those two indicators. I'm super over time, but I want to sort of conclude. I mean, I have a whole section on what should be done, but I'll just stop, I think, with the Philippine Development Plan. Our main criticism, and we argue the premises that should be reconsidered for the Philippine Development Plan to bring about that social and economic transformation, it has to reimagine the economy, it has to rethink economic policy, it has to reinvent economic policy to be giving that social economic transformation. And I think some of the current propaganda lines reflect, we believe, a failed economic philosophy. The rebound from reopening, that fast growth last year, that's not momentum. That was just a rebound from a very, very low base. Secondly, growth is not development. We've had rapid growth for the past 20 years, but it's not actually materializing in terms of development. It is materializing in terms of wealth for a few, in terms of corporate profits, including foreign transnational corporate profits, but it is not actually leading to broad-based socioeconomic development for the majority. Employment does not mean incomes in a context of we have, where estimate over 70% of the labor force is actually informal. employment is no longer enough to have incomes, and much more intervention are needed there. Key point for us, especially amid all the cha-cha discussions right now, foreign investment does not lead to development. That was a wrong kind of thinking. Was promoted in the 1980s, especially right now, 4 decades later. I think there is actually much more evidence to show that foreign investment may have a role in development, but you need the corresponding foreign investment regime to make sure that they do have more more contributions to long-term development, not the short-term indicators of investment, a few jobs and foreign exchange earnings. Infrastructure has a one whole chapter, still a key peg of the Philippine Development Plan, as with the previous administration. We all want connectivity, but it's always going to be a question of connectivity for what? If it's not connectivity linked to a larger plan for agricultural and industrial development, that connectivity will benefit the exact same service economy we have been deteriorating into for the last 40 years. So it can play a key role, but again, as with any dish that you cook, it all depends on what are the other ingredients there as well for it to contribute as they should. Otherwise, if not, it's overspending for luxury items that we can either afford or actually really benefit from. Climate talk is cheap, but if there's one thing, but there are many things that needs a firm government commitment in terms of giving resources and reprioritizing how resources are spent. The Philippines, the UN said, we're reaching a tipping point by 2040, by which time climate change is irreversible. Yeah, no precision there, but it's easy to talk about climate change, but if we don't see the decisive measures for that, that's all going to be rhetoric. Last 2 points are all about resources. The PDP, unfortunately, elevates fiscal consolidation to be an end in itself. So the cuts in social protection, the very, very small increases in social spending in 2023, that is the start of, I think, 6 years of a problematic undeclared austerity measures hitting the poor and middle class the most. Last point about resource generation, that growth has benefited Filipinos, but it's benefited a narrow slice of Filipinos. We think regressive taxes are easy to implement. The World Bank loves VAT. The government loves consumption taxes because people complain, but in the end it's railroaded. But we do argue a politically more progressive tax system, economically more progressive tax system, is more important to generate the hundreds of billions of pesos we need for development. Our bottom line, again, to paraphrase Einstein, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. The PDP has the same old philosophy, approach, and policies of the past 4 decades of PDPs. Because it is an essentially unchanged document, it has some, talk about digitalization and, so some new buzzwords today, but it will be keeping us in the same underdevelopment trajectory we've been on for the last 4 decades. I'm sorry for going over time. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, since the formal session ends in 13 minutes, we'd like to ask this question and let other questions come in. But the question we want to ask every speaker is this. Our chairman, our departed chairman, said that these forums are not good. Well, they're good in themselves, but they can be much better. And he wants us to do this, to translate what we learn in the forum into action. So, Mr. Africa, first of all, I congratulate you for your very explicit and clear exposition. I'd like to tell you some good news. As you know, in the RCEP fight, we have said that agriculture is really the loser. And for the first time in history, they've done something they never did. And you can give us the credit because we pushed for what we call conditionalities. The resolution is 1/4 page. The conditions are 4 pages. And of course, all that is junk if they don't mean it, but they think they mean it. So we're involved in that. But a lot of what we're saying would be consistent with the direction you're talking about. So the question we want to ask you before we end is this. What can we, having listened to you, being educated, enlightened, and maybe some disagreements, but what can we do as citizens, we're agribusiness people, connections with banks, with NGOs, with government people, etc. What can we do to help promote this vision that you're talking about? What can we do?
Okay. Ibon, we are a research group, but ultimately we are a research group that works with the country's social movements. One of the most disappointing things about economic policy making, it's actually partly about arguments, but mostly about political muscle. And unfortunately, I think where we're lacking right now is not lack of evidence of the problems with trade liberalization on agriculture, or not any question of what can the state do to promote Philippine agriculture. It's lack of political muscle. So on our part as Ibon, that is why we work closely with social movements. That's to give them the objective basis for making their voices felt, lobbying Congress, lobbying line agencies for some kind of change. I think it has to be complemented because social movements in the Philippines have tended to be quite strong in terms of the basic sectors, but we have tended to have more vacillating business groups. And I think business groups have an outsized voice in policy making. I know there are hierarchies even within business groups. The folks we see attending, the World Economic Forum with the president, I mean, medyo malapit sa kusina. But I think combining social movements from the sectors with more business groups, providing a united front in terms of specific, practical, doable policy measures right now, and then ensuring a longer view for policy making. I think if that can happen, that we can sort of come together to sort of feed off each other's voices, I think that's where we're actually quite lacking right now. I don't think it's going to be a problem of lack of evidence. We have rich evidence, rich negative experience from the Philippine case. Really getting our political act together, I think, and making sure that we are listened to and paid more attention to than we are right now.
Just a soundbite, then I'll turn the floor over. The chairman, Julius, is very progressive. He's calling a board meeting at lunch today. We'll discuss this because we are a business group. And you're saying that we being a business group should have our voices heard, especially if we're in the minority in many cases, right? So I thank you for it. Julius, I just want to hear what he wants us to do. And we'll talk about it in the board. Okay, thank you, Mr. Africa. Julius, take it over. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sure, thanks very much, Ernie. I hope you don't mind that I did the introduction earlier. I apologize for your difficulty entering earlier this morning. Okay, yeah, this is a very interesting topic for me in particular. I am in between two different generations with very different ideas of what it means to be a businessman, what it means to be an entrepreneur, what it means to be a business leader. So obviously a lot of people in my generation and younger are looking at things in terms of like, what our social impact is and so on. So it's a very interesting topic. And I think a lot of our members are very interested in that as well. So yeah, we have some time for a few questions. Again, for those who would like to ask questions, you can raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. Please do rename yourselves to your particular name so that we can identify you when we call you. Sonny, up to what time can you give us? We do have an informal session coming after this.
Actually, I blocked off until 9:45. If that's okay.
Excellent. Okay, so we have quite a lot of time for questions in our informal session. Okay, so let's go to our open forum, and I already see Rene has his hand raised. Rene, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep,
Sunny,
loud
can
and
you hear
clear.
me? Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, Sunny, I appreciate your talk today. Very, very nice and very well covered. I would like to point out something that probably needs also to be inputted into your analysis. I was invited to the UPLB to give a talk on food and logistics. Since these are my businesses, I went there and I gave the talk. After more than an hour of PowerPoint presentation and discussions, I raised the issue of them asking questions. More than 400 attendees, not a single one was raising his hand, including professors and students among the UPLB studentry. Now, that was very perplexing for me because the talk was about food and logistics. So I said, okay, let me turn the table around and let me just be the one to ask the question. First question I asked is, does your curriculum include value chain and supply chain? And immediately they said no.
Hmm.
The point that I'm raising right now is probably the biggest problem that we have, and the foundation of all the issues that you are talking about is really miseducation. Miseducation because they're only teaching a 1950s type of agriculture. It's not modern agriculture. The same curriculum that was started in the immediately after World War II is still the same curriculum that is being taught today. Nothing has changed. It's not even developmental agriculture. So you cannot expect from the graduate bureaucrats who became people leading the DA today. You cannot expect anything from them because they did not learn it. They cannot give what they did not have. So you should probably go back there and include it in your analysis, because we really need to change the curriculum. Sadly, it turned out that the UPLB curriculum is being borrowed by all the colleges of agriculture nationwide. It's their curriculum as well. So if the problem of UPLB is not corrected and resolved, then we are really suffering nationwide because it's the same curriculum. So as we have a president who has taken over the DA position and explicitly stating value chain, value chain, value chain, how do you expect the DA today, with all the bureaucrats graduated from all this old curriculum, how do you expect them to do the value chain? They don't even know how. This is the reason why we have unempowered, unenabled farmers, fishermen, and especially the IPs. No, it has to start from somewhere, and obviously my analysis is it's really starting from there. No, it's an academic miseducation.
Mm.
Thank you.
Sir Julius, can I quickly respond?
Sure,
Okay.
of course.
Okay. Sir Rene, I super completely agree. I think what's been lacking, especially the last 40 years, is not just updating curriculum in general, but actually updating our thinking in particular. We've been regressing. One thing for us, for instance, in Ibon, one thing we are welcoming in the current post-pandemic context of growing protectionism, even by the United States, by China, by Japan, by the European Union. One thing we want to seize on that is if even the most advanced economies in the world are seeing the need for government intervention to strengthen their domestic industries, regardless I mean, I read The Economist, it's wonderfully written, it's very lucid, but regardless of free market people whining, yeah, but they shouldn't do that. The point is they're doing it. So the political logic for protection, for state support, for sectors that they think they want to strengthen, we think actually, if anything, that affirms that 40 years of so-called globalization and free market policies, that's a soft underbelly. And para sa amin, especially in the case of the Philippines, it's so tragic that agriculture has been so neglected. Parang attrition din siya, di ba? It's not just being it's not developing, it's being left behind. So I do agree that we have to improve the education, the curriculum, but we also want to add it should be put in a broader frame. So what is the long view in terms of agriculture development? There are roles to be played by the private sector, and we argue, again, to be clear, Ibon naman has never promoted a commandist statist economy. I mean, if there's one insight from the commandist economies of the Soviet Union, it's that you can dictate on everyone. That's not going to happen. So if anything, exploit the benefits of the private sector who can be motivated, but in particular will actually behave predictably. So agribusiness will behave predictably in terms of where there's actually profits to be made, and in that process, they can contribute to production. For us, that highlights not only that the private sector should be supported, but in particular, it highlights that the government should be creating the conditions so that the profit-seeking creative impulse of the private sector goes in a particular long-term strategic direction. So that's why sa amin, it's so important to look at for the current economic team to get rid of this super obsolete idea that the free market will develop. The market has a contribution to development, but it has to be guided, which means na we're right now, the lesser of two evils with a bad government is not surrendering to the market, because we have been surrendering to the market as far as the laws allow, and that's where we are right now. The lesser of two evils actually is, despite the misregulation of the economy, despite the abuse of powers by government, let's make government more democratic. Let's make it more accountable to the people, because it's the wrong direction to surrender the potential for government to contribute. That's why my last slide was about the relative size of the Philippine state. Actually, that's what we have to work with right now. We have to work with not just a very corrupt government, we also have to work with a very emaciated government. So parang, as opposed to other countries that might have corrupt governments, but at least have stronger interventionist mechanisms in place, that's easier to wield to create the space for the private sector to do what they do best, which is improve efficiency, increase your profits. But sa amin, that's something that's always our dilemma. Our government's so awful that we don't want to give them more powers. But the reality is, if you want to develop the economy, develop in a strategic direction, you have to give the government more powers. So may two steps tayo: give it more powers, but also make it more transparent and accountable. And I really do want to stress, it's so important to look at the experience right now of the US spending $1 trillion over the next decade to develop its semicon and green technologies. It's a huge state intervention by the most powerful economy in the world. Even China's approaching it pa lang. If they feel the need to intervene, parang we should as well, because we're starting from a very weak base as it is. In agriculture, for us, that is the foundation. That is what we have the most experience with. It's so sad. There's a lot of gloating about, oh look, the Philippines exports 1/3 of hard drives or 1/5 of semiconductors. It's not the Philippines exporting. It's locators in our economic zones where we're prohibited from using their technology. They're the ones exporting to the Philippines, not Filipinos. At unlike that, in agriculture talaga, there are Filipino farmers kind of aging, there are Filipino fisher folk, there is domestic agribusiness. Yun, Filipino talaga yun. And for us, it's a much stronger potential base than, shallow, low value added manufacturing foreign exporters in special economic zone enclaves. Sorry na pahaba. Short lang.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's all right. So we're out of time for our formal session. So as I think Bernice already informed you previously, we do have a formal session, and we do understand that some people can only stay for the formal session. They may have other engagements or appointments at 9 o'clock. So we do end our formal session. We give our appreciation now. So if I may just ask for the certificate of appreciation. Okay, so MAP ABCDF are together with our special partner institutions, senior special partner institutions, corporate members, and individual members present this certificate of appreciation to Jose Enrique Soni Africa for his invaluable support in the advocacy and promotion of agribusiness and countryside development, and for his commendable and unselfish services rendered to this foundation as our resource speaker for our 6th weekly online meeting of 2023, given this 21st day of February, signed myself as chairman and Ernie Ordonez as our president. For those of you who do need to go ahead, thank you very much for joining us for our formal session.
Thank you.
For those of you who can stay for our informal session, please do, as the conversation usually gets a lot more lively in that. But for those of you who do have to leave, do stay tuned, because next week's presentation, if we can just flash that. Next week's session, a modern day terra preta. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with terra preta, it's the semi-mythological black soil of the Amazon forest, rainforest. So apparently a self-sustaining soil regeneration system that some people are trying to recover, by Arnold Alagar, co-founder of Agria International. So for those of you who are interested in this, especially those who are interested in soil conservation and regeneration, I'm sure this would be a session worth joining. So for those of you who would like to join us, then we'll see you next week. And if you do have to go ahead, thank you for joining us this morning. And we hope to see you again soon. For those of you who are joining us again later through our social media on YouTube or on Facebook, MAP ABCDF is a member-supported nonprofit organization, and we would like to have you on board with us as a member if you'd like to, especially engage with our speakers, with our network of agribusiness and countryside development professionals and organizations. Do consider that. Send us an email at register@map-abcdf.org. Link is in the description. And before the rest of you go, may we please have a group photo? So I'd like to invite everyone to please open your cameras and give us your biggest smiles.
As we smile, Mr. Chairman, remind them that this is on YouTube, free for everyone 2 weeks from now. And I recommend this particular forum should be seen by as many people as possible because it gives a good picture.
Sure.
I'm just killing time as we set up the photographs, but for those of you who haven't heard this, we are free 2 weeks after the forum, right? Everyone is very important. Okay, there's my Tokaya. Go ahead.
All right.
Sorry, but you're taking. We're not supposed to talk.
No problem, no problem. All right, Henry, if you'd like to count us in.
All right po. In 3, 2, 1, smile. Isa pa po. 3, 2, 1, smile. All right po. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much to everyone. And for those of you who have to go ahead, please, you're free to go ahead. For those of you who can stay, please do stay. I think our informal session is going to be quite the lively.